The alarm on my wrist buzzed hard enough to sting, and I knew before I even looked at it that something had gone wrong at the palace. My name is Ronan Vale, and 3 years ago I was the only human allowed to set foot inside the Voss Dominion without an armed escort. That night, running down a marble hallway that glowed faintly blue under my boots, I was not thinking about treaties or diplomacy. I was thinking about a girl I had never met, and about the fact that the guards outside her chamber had just been ordered to stand down. That never happened in the Dominion. Guards did not stand down, not unless someone very powerful wanted something to happen without witnesses. I pushed through the doors without knocking. The princess of the Voss Dominion was lying on a cot that looked more like a shipping crate than a bed, her thin arms wrapped around herself, her skin the pale gray of someone who had not seen real light in months. She looked up at me, with eyes too large for her face, and said nothing. She did not need to. I had read her file. Illyra Vantor, 17 years old by her people's counting, only daughter of King Dreven Vantor, ruler of 11 worlds and heir to nothing, because her body was failing and her father's court had already decided she was not worth saving. I had come to that room to deliver medical supplies as part of a routine exchange. Instead, I found the king himself standing in the shadows near the window, arms folded, watching his daughter the way a man watches a machine he has already written off as broken. "You are the human liaison," he said, without turning around. His voice had the low, grinding quality that all Vantor males seemed to share, like stone dragged over stone. Vale, the engineer who fixed our reactor grid last cycle. "That's right," I said carefully. Something about the room felt wrong, like walking into a trap that had already been set before I arrived. "Good, then you understand mechanisms. You understand what happens when a part no longer serves its function." I looked at the girl on the cot. She had gone very still, the way people go still when they are trying not to be noticed, trying to disappear into the background of a conversation that is about them but not for them. "She is not a machine," I said. The king finally turned. His eyes were the deep amber color of his entire species, cold and calculating, the eyes of a man who had ruled for 4 decades and had learned to feel nothing when it was inconvenient to feel anything. "No, she is worse. A machine can be discarded without ceremony. A daughter requires paperwork." He crossed the room in 3 long strides and stopped in front of me, close enough that I could smell the metallic tang of the medicine keeping his own aging body upright. "I am giving her to you." I actually laughed. A short disbelieving sound that died the moment I saw his face had not changed at all. "You're not serious." "I am the king. I am always serious." He gestured toward Illyra without looking at her, the way someone gestures toward a piece of furniture they are trying to get rid of. "Our physicians have exhausted every treatment our science allows. She is dying, slowly and without dignity, and her condition has become a liability to the succession. Rival houses circle her like carrion birds. If she dies here, in this palace, it becomes a crisis. If she dies somewhere else, quietly, among humans who do not matter to Dominion politics, it becomes a footnote." The girl on the cot made a small sound. I realized after a moment that it was a laugh, bitter and short, the kind of laugh that comes from someone who has heard themselves discussed as a problem to be solved so many times that it no longer surprises them. "Don't waste your outrage on him," she said to me. Her voice was quiet, but there was an edge underneath it, sharp as broken glass. "He is not being cruel, he is being efficient. It is worse." I looked at her properly then, past the gray skin and the thin arms and the machines humming quietly beside her cot. There was something in her eyes that had nothing to do with weakness. Anger, maybe, or the last ember of pride in someone who refuses to let her circumstances define her, even while her own father stands 3 feet away, discussing her death like a scheduling problem. "I won't take her," I said. "I'm not a courier for a body you want to disappear." The king's expression did not change, but something in the air of the room did, a pressure shift, the kind you feel before a storm. "You misunderstand the offer, Vale." This is not a request. Your government has been asking for expanded trade access to the Outer Ring for 2 years. I am prepared to grant it. In exchange, you take my daughter off this world, and whatever happens to her happens far from my court and my enemies. If she dies among your people, no Dominion house can claim it was murder. If she somehow lives, and here his mouth twisted into something that was not quite a smile, then I suppose that will be your peculiar species problem to explain, not mine. I understood then that I was not being asked to save anyone. I was being handed a discarded problem wrapped in the language of diplomacy, and the price of refusing it would be paid by thousands of humans waiting on a trade agreement that mattered to people far above my pay grade. I looked at Alira. She was watching me with an expression I would spend the next several months trying to understand, somewhere between defiance and the exhausted resignation of someone who expects to be disappointed by everyone, including herself. "You don't have to pretend this is kindness," she said to me, her chin lifting slightly, despite the tremor in her hands. "I know what I am to him, a liability with a pulse. You can take me to your ship and forget about me the moment the cargo doors close. I would prefer it, honestly. I have had enough of being someone's inconvenient charity." Something about the flatness in her voice made my chest tighten in a way I did not expect. I had spent 3 years learning to read Dominion body language, the subtle shifts in posture and vocal pitch that gave away what their carefully controlled faces would not. What I saw in her was not fragility, it was armor, built out of pride, the only thing she had left that no one could take from her. "I don't forget about people," I said, "not even inconvenient ones." The king made a small sound that might have been amusement. "How very human of you. Take her, Vale. The transport leaves within the hour. I trust you can manage the arrangements without further sentiment." He left the room without looking back at his daughter, his footsteps fading down the corridor with the unhurried confidence of a man who had already closed the chapter of his life that involved her. I stood there for a long moment in the silence he left behind, looking at a girl who had just been given away like an object nobody wanted on their shelf anymore. "Well," Alira said eventually, her voice steady despite everything. "Are you going to stand there staring, or are you going to help me up? I would like to leave this room before I have to watch him walk away from me one more time." I crossed the room and knelt beside her cot. Up close, I could see the tremor in her hands more clearly, the sheen of sweat on her forehead despite the coolness of the room, the way her breathing had a slight catch to it that spoke of lungs working harder than they should have to. Whatever illness had taken hold of her, it had been allowed to run unchecked for a long time, treated as an inconvenience rather than an emergency. "I'm not going to promise you anything," I told her honestly, because I had learned early that Dominion people respected honesty far more than comfort. "I don't know if we can fix whatever is wrong with you. I don't know what our medicine can do that yours couldn't. But I promise you this, wherever you're going, you're not going there as cargo, you're going there as a person, and you'll be treated like one." She studied my face for a long moment, searching for the lie she clearly expected to find. When she didn't find it, something in her shoulders loosened, just slightly, like a held breath finally released. "That is either the kindest thing anyone has said to me in years," she said quietly, "or the most naive." "Maybe it's both," I said, and helped her to her feet. She was lighter than she should have been, her weight barely more than a child's, though her eyes carried the exhaustion of someone who had been fighting a losing battle for far longer than any child should have to. As we made our way out of the palace, past guards who would not meet her eyes and courtiers who pretended not to notice her passing, I understood that whatever waited for us on the other side of that transport, we were leaving behind a world that had already decided her story was over. I intended to prove them wrong. The transport ship hummed quietly around us as it lifted off the Dominion capital, the palace shrinking to a glittering speck below, then to nothing at all. Alira sat rigid in her seat, staring at the small viewport as her homeworld disappeared, and I did not try to fill the silence with false comfort. Some moments do not need words, they only need someone willing to sit beside you while you carry them. "Do you know what the strange part is?" she said eventually, without looking away from the window. "He did not even say goodbye. Not truly. A king does not say goodbye to a mistake." "You're not a mistake," I said. She turned to look at me then, and for the first time, I saw something other than resignation in her expression. It was small, barely a flicker, but it was there. Curiosity, maybe. Or the first faint stirring of someone who has been told what she is for so long that she has forgotten to ask what she might become. "We will see, human," she said. "We will see." I did not know it then, but those words would come to define everything that followed. Because the girl sitting beside me on that transport, frail and discarded and furious in ways she had not yet learned to show, was about to become something her father's entire empire would never have believed possible. She just needed someone to give her the chance to try. The medical bay on the human outpost of Chorus Station smelled like antiseptic and burnt coffee, and Illyra hated it from the first breath she took inside it. "This place is loud," she said, wincing as the automatic doors hissed shut behind us. "And it smells wrong." "Give it a chance," I told her, guiding her toward the examination room where Dr. Maren Block was already waiting, a data slate in hand, and an expression of careful professional curiosity on her face. Maren had spent 15 years treating everything from mining accidents to rare genetic disorders across 3 different colonies, but I could tell even she was uncertain about what she was looking at when Illyra sat down on the examination table. "Princess Vantor," Maren said, her voice gentle but businesslike. "I've reviewed the files your father's physicians sent over. I want to run our own scans before we assume anything they concluded still applies." Illyra's jaw tightened. My father's physicians were quite thorough. They confirmed there is nothing more to be done. "With respect," Maren said, already activating the scanning array around the table, "your father's physicians work within Dominion medical frameworks. We don't. Different framework, different possibilities. Let's just see what we're actually dealing with before we agree with anyone's conclusions." I watched Illyra's face during the scan, the tension in her shoulders, the way she kept her eyes fixed on a point on the ceiling, as if bracing herself for another confirmation of failure. I understood that bracing. I had seen it in soldiers who had been told too many times that their injuries were permanent, that hope was a luxury they could no longer afford. It was a particular kind of exhaustion, the exhaustion of surviving disappointment so many times that you build walls around your expectations just to protect what little is left of yourself. The scan took almost an hour. When it finished, Maren studied her slate for a long moment, her brow furrowed in concentration, before she looked up. "This is not what I expected," she said. Illyra's voice was flat. "Confirmation, then." "Wonderful." "No," Maren said, and there was something careful and deliberate in the way she chose her next words. "This is a metabolic disorder. Your body isn't processing certain proteins correctly, which is causing progressive muscle and organ degradation. It's serious. It's been allowed to progress for far too long without proper intervention. But it is not, as far as our medicine is concerned, untreatable." The silence that followed was the kind that changes the temperature of a room. "Say that again," Illyra said quietly. "Your condition is treatable," Maren repeated. "Not easily, not quickly. It will require gene therapy, sustained physical rehabilitation, and probably more patience than either of us would like. But treatable means exactly what it sounds like. This does not have to be the end of your story." I watched something break open in Illyra's expression, a crack in the careful armor she had built around herself, and for a moment I thought she might cry. Instead, her hands curled into fists at her sides, and when she spoke, her voice trembled with something that was not sadness at all. "They told me there was nothing left to try," she said. "My own physicians, my own father. They looked at every scan you are looking at right now and decided I was not worth the effort of a solution." "Then they were wrong," Maren said simply, without drama, the way a person states a fact rather than offers comfort. "Or they decided it wasn't worth the political cost of fixing you. Either way, We're not going to make the same mistake." Ilira looked at me then, and I saw the question in her eyes before she asked it. Why? Why would strangers from another world spend resources and time on a problem her own people had already discarded? "Because that's not how we do things," I said. "We don't decide someone's worth based on how easy they are to fix." She did not answer, but I saw her swallow hard, and for the rest of that first week, she was quieter than usual, watching everything around her, with the careful, suspicious attention of someone who expected the ground to shift beneath her feet at any moment. The treatment began 3 days later. It was not gentle. Gene therapy on a physiology none of our doctors had ever treated before meant careful, incremental doses, constant monitoring, and long stretches of discomfort that Ilira endured with gritted teeth and very little complaint, though I could see in her eyes how much it cost her. The first month brought no visible change at all, and I watched the hope in her expression dim a little more each week, replaced by the old resignation creeping back in like water finding cracks in a wall. "Perhaps this was foolish," she said one evening, sitting in the small quarters we had arranged for her, staring at the untouched tray of food beside her. "Perhaps your doctor is simply kinder than mine, and kindness is not the same as capability. You've had 3 months of this disease," I said, sitting down across from her. "You've had 1 month of treatment. Give it time before you decide it's failed." "You sound very certain." "I'm not certain of anything," I admitted, "but I've seen people give up on things far too early because the results didn't arrive on schedule. I'd rather be patient and wrong than impatient and give up on something that might have worked." She studied me for a long moment, her large amber eyes searching my face the way she always did when she was trying to decide whether I was telling the truth or simply telling her what she wanted to hear. "You are a strange creature, Ronan Vale," she said finally. "Your people build machines that can travel between stars, yet you speak like a farmer discussing crops, patience, time, as if the universe simply rewards those who wait long enough." "It doesn't," I said. "It rewards people who keep working, even when waiting gets hard. That's the part nobody tells you about patience. It's not passive. It's the hardest kind of work there is." She was quiet after that, but I noticed she ate more of her dinner than she had in days. The turning point came in the 2nd month, subtle at first, easy to miss if you were not watching closely. Ilira's hands stopped trembling quite as much during her morning treatments. Her breathing, once shallow and effortful, began to deepen. Marin noted small but measurable improvements in her scans, muscle density increasing fractionally, organ function stabilizing rather than continuing its slow decline. The first time Ilira stood without support, she nearly fell, catching herself on the edge of the medical table with a gasp that was half surprise and half something closer to disbelief. "Did you see that?" she said, breathless, staring at her own hands as if they belonged to someone else. I stood, on my own. "I saw it," I said, and I could not keep the grin off my face. "It was only a few seconds. It was a few seconds more than you've had in years." She looked at me, and for the first time since I had met her, I saw something in her expression that was unmistakably joy, raw and unguarded, and completely unlike the careful composure she usually wore like a second skin. It did not last long. Old habits of restraint reasserted themselves quickly, the way they always did with her, but for that brief moment, I saw the person she might become if given enough time and enough reason to believe in herself. Physical therapy became a daily ritual after that, brutal and exhausting in ways that tested her patience as much as her body. She fell more times than either of us could count, her frustration boiling over into sharp words she usually apologized for later, embarrassed by her own temper. I never minded the outbursts. I understood them. Anger, I had learned, was often just grief wearing a different face, and Ilira had a great deal to grieve. The body she had known her whole life, weak and failing as it was, had at least been familiar. This new body, slowly gaining strength she did not know how to wield, was a foreign country she was learning to navigate one stumbling step at a time. "Why do you push me so hard?" she demanded one afternoon, sweat soaking through her training clothes as she sat on the floor of the small gym we had converted for her use, refusing my offered hand. "Your doctor tells you my progress is remarkable already. Why is that not enough for you?" "It's not about enough," I said, sitting down on the floor beside her instead of pulling her up. "It's about what you're capable of if you don't stop the moment it gets hard. Your father's court decided you were finished before you even had a real chance to fight. I'm not going to make that same mistake by deciding you're finished the moment progress feels comfortable enough." She was silent for a long moment, staring at her own trembling hands. "In the Dominion," she said quietly, "weakness is something to be hidden, not overcome. We do not speak of struggle. We simply disappear those who struggle too visibly, tuck them away where the court does not have to look at them. My father did not banish me to your world out of cruelty alone. He banished me because my weakness embarrassed him, and disappearing me was cleaner than acknowledging it." "That's a terrible way to treat people," I said honestly. "Struggle isn't shameful. It's just what growing looks like from the inside. Nobody gets strong without first being weak and choosing to keep going anyway." She looked up at me, something unreadable moving behind her eyes. "Your people truly believe this? That struggle has value, rather than being something to hide?" "We don't just believe it," I said. "We build entire lives around it. Every scientist who fails 1,000 times before finding an answer. Every soldier who trains until their body breaks down just so it can rebuild stronger. Every person who falls down and gets back up one more time than they fell. That's not weakness, Alira. That's the entire engine of what makes us who we are." She did not answer right away, but that night, for the first time since I had known her, she asked to continue her training session even after Marin had cleared her to rest for the day. It was a small thing, easy to overlook, but I recognized it for what it truly was. The first flicker of a fire that had been buried under years of being told it did not deserve to burn. Over the following weeks, that fire grew. She began asking questions about human history, devouring records of wars fought against impossible odds, stories of explorers who pressed onward through disaster after disaster, refusing to accept defeat as a final answer. She asked about our sports, our competitions, the strange human obsession with pushing bodies and minds past their supposed limits, simply to see how far they could go. Each story she absorbed seemed to feed something in her that had been starving for a very long time, a hunger for the idea that struggle itself could be a source of pride rather than shame. One evening, nearly 4 months after we had left the Dominion capital, I found her standing on her own in the small courtyard outside the medical wing, watching the twin moons of Chorus Station rise over the horizon. She stood straighter than I had ever seen her stand, her breathing steady, her hands no longer trembling at her sides. "I used to think strength was something you were born with," she said, without turning to look at me, her voice carrying a new quality I had not heard in her before, something solid and certain. "My father believed this. His court believed this. If you were born strong, you ruled. If you were born weak, you were quietly removed from the story before you could embarrass anyone. And now?" She turned to face me, and in the pale light of the rising moons, I saw someone very different from the fragile girl I had carried out of that palace so many months before. Her posture had changed. Her eyes carried a new clarity, sharp and certain in a way that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with hard-won belief in herself. "Now I think strength is something you choose, every single day, for as long as it takes," she said. "I think my father was wrong about everything that mattered, and I intend to prove it." I did not know then just how far she would carry that belief, or how completely it would remake her before the story was finished. But standing there in that courtyard, watching her stand tall under an alien sky for the first time in years, I understood that whatever fragile, discarded girl her father had handed away like an inconvenience was already gone. Something entirely new had taken her place, and it was only just beginning to show its strength. 6 months after we left the Dominion capital, Ilira asked me to teach her how to fight. We were sitting in the station's small observation deck, watching cargo haulers drift past the viewport, when she brought it up without warning, the way she often did when she had been quietly turning an idea over in her mind for days before finally deciding to speak it aloud. "I want to learn combat," she said. "Not the ceremonial forms my tutors taught me as a child. Real combat, the kind your soldiers train in." I studied her for a moment. In the months since her recovery had truly begun, she had changed in ways that went far beyond her physical health. Her shoulders had filled out with new muscle earned through months of grueling therapy. Her voice had gained a confidence it had never carried before. But there was still something guarded in her eyes, a wariness that told me this request was not simply about physical training. "Why combat?" I asked. "Why now?" "Because I am done being something that happens to me," she said, and there was steel in her voice I had not heard before. "My whole life, decisions were made about my body, my worth, my future, by everyone except me. My father decided I was a liability. His physicians decided I was untreatable. His court decided I was an embarrassment. I want to learn to protect what is mine. I want to learn to stand for myself so that no one ever again gets to decide my fate without my consent." I understood then that this was not really about combat at all. It was about reclaiming something that had been stolen from her long before her illness had ever taken hold, the simple right to determine the shape of her own life. "All right," I said, "but I'll warn you now, this is going to be harder than the physical therapy. Combat training isn't just about strength, it's about discipline, patience, and learning to fail without letting failure break you." "I have had a great deal of practice failing without breaking," she said, the corner of her mouth lifting in something close to a smile. "I think I can manage." We began the following morning in the station's training gym, an unremarkable room filled with mats and equipment that Ilira approached with the same fierce determination she brought to everything else in her recovery. I started her with the basics: footwork, balance, the fundamentals of movement that every fighter needed before they could hope to master anything more complex. She struggled at first, her body still relearning coordination after years of weakness, but she never once complained about the difficulty. She simply got back up every time she fell, her jaw set with the same stubborn resolve I had come to recognize as entirely her own. Weeks turned into months. Her progress, much like her physical recovery, was not linear. Some days she moved with a grace that surprised even Marin, who dropped by occasionally to monitor her physical condition and left each time shaking her head in quiet astonishment at how far she had come. Other days, frustration got the better of her, and she would storm off the mat, furious at herself for a stumble or a missed strike that seemed, to me, entirely unremarkable for someone still learning. "You're too hard on yourself," I told her one evening, after a particularly difficult session ended with her sitting against the wall, breathing hard, refusing to meet my eyes. "I have spent my entire life being told I was not enough," she said quietly. "I do not know how to simply be adequate at something. I only know how to try to be perfect, because perfect was the only thing that might have earned me a place in my father's court." "You don't need to be perfect here," I said, sitting down beside her. "You just need to keep showing up. That's all any of this requires." She was quiet for a long moment before she spoke again, her voice softer than I had heard it in weeks. "Do you know what the strangest part of all this is, Ronan? I do not miss the Dominion. I do not miss the palace, or the court, or even the throne that I understood. Deep down, I would likely never have been permitted to inherit, even if I had remained perfectly healthy. My father would have found some other reason to pass me over. There was always some other reason." She paused. "The only thing I miss is the idea of what it could have been, if things had been different, if I had been born strong, if my mother had lived to advocate for me, if... You don't need any of those ifs anymore," I said. "You're building something entirely new for yourself now. That's not a lesser thing than what you lost. In some ways, I think it might be a greater one, because nobody gave it to you. You're earning every piece of it yourself." She looked at me for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind her amber eyes, before she nodded slowly and pushed herself back to her feet, ready to continue training despite her exhaustion. By the 8th month, her transformation had become something the entire station had begun to notice. Engineers and pilots, who had once regarded her with polite but distant curiosity, now greeted her by name in the corridors. Children on the station, fascinated by the tall, striking alien woman who trained every morning in the gym with a fierce intensity that seemed to grow with each passing week, began following her at a respectful distance, peppering her with questions about her homeworld that she answered with surprising patience and, more surprisingly still, genuine warmth. I watched her become something new in those months, not merely a survivor of illness and rejection, but a person forging an identity entirely of her own making. She began studying our history in earnest, not simply as an intellectual exercise, but as a genuine attempt to understand the values that had shaped the people who had chosen to save her when her own had chosen to let her go. She read about explorers who set off toward the unknown with no guarantee of return. She studied our wars, not with fascination for the fighting itself, but with deep interest in the stories of ordinary people who had found extraordinary resolve in the face of overwhelming odds. "Your species has such a strange relationship with hope," she told me one night, several data slates scattered across the table in front of her, filled with notes in her careful, precise handwriting. "You build entire cultures around the idea that circumstances can change, that the underdog can triumph, that today's failure does not determine tomorrow's outcome. My people do not believe this. We believe in fixed hierarchies, fixed destinies. If you are born to rule, you rule. If you are born weak, you remain weak until you are quietly removed from the story." "And what do you believe now?" I asked her. She considered the question seriously, the way she considered everything now, with a thoughtfulness that had not existed in the frightened, resigned girl I had first met in that palace so many months ago. "I believe," she said slowly, "that my father's entire philosophy of strength was built on a foundation of fear that anything less than perfect control invites chaos, fear that weakness, once permitted to exist, might spread and destroy everything they have built. But I have seen something different here, among your people. I have seen that strength built through struggle is far more durable than strength simply inherited by birth. A muscle that has never been tested will fail the first time it is truly needed, but a muscle that has been broken down and rebuilt again and again, that muscle endures." Her combat training progressed alongside this deepening philosophy, and by the 10th month she had begun sparring with some of the station's junior security personnel, holding her own against opponents who had trained for years while she had trained for less than one. She was not undefeated, not by any measure. She lost far more sparring matches than she won in those early months. But something in the way she lost had changed entirely, from the girl who had once refused help simply because accepting it felt like an admission of weakness. Now, every loss became a lesson she absorbed hungrily, dissecting her own mistakes with the same clinical precision she once reserved for despising her own frail body. "You fought well today," I told her after a particularly grueling session where she had been thrown to the mat more times than either of us cared to count. "I lost every match," she said, wiping sweat from her brow, though there was no despair in her voice anymore, only a kind of fierce satisfaction. "You lost every match against opponents who have trained for years longer than you have," I said. "And you're getting back up faster after every fall. That's not losing, Alira. That's winning slower than you'd like." She laughed then, a real laugh, unguarded and bright, the kind of sound I had never once heard from her during those first desperate weeks in the medical bay. "Winning slower than I would like," she repeated. "I think I like that phrase. It feels honest." "It's the truest thing I know about getting stronger," I said. "Nobody wins fast. They just refuse to stop losing, until eventually they don't lose anymore." By the end of that year, Word of the transformed princess had begun quietly circulating beyond Chorus Station, carried through trade channels and diplomatic whispers back toward the Dominion itself. I did not think much of it at the time, too consumed with watching Alira's continued growth, both physical and otherwise, to consider what those whispers might eventually mean for the fragile political balance her father had so carefully constructed around her supposed death. She had begun training with weapons by then as well, favoring a style of close combat that blended human military technique with the more fluid, almost dance-like movements of traditional Dominion forms she had learned as a child but never truly mastered under her illness. Watching her spar, watching the fluid confidence with which she now moved through space that had once betrayed her with every trembling step, it was difficult to reconcile the woman before me with the frail, discarded girl I had carried out of that palace little more than a year before. One evening, after a training session that left both of us exhausted and satisfied in the particular way that only genuine progress can provide, Alira sat across from me at the small table in her quarters, studying a data slate filled with information about Dominion politics that she had requested from our intelligence contacts weeks earlier. "My father's position has weakened," she said without preamble, her expression unreadable. "There are whispers among the rival houses, questions about his judgment, questions about why he gave away a daughter who has apparently not only survived but thrived among the very species his court considers beneath consideration." "How does that make you feel?" I asked carefully. She set the slate down and looked at me, and in her eyes I saw something that had not been there when I first met her, something forged through months of struggle and small, hard-won victories. Not simple anger, though anger was certainly present. Not simple satisfaction at her father's discomfort, though I suspected some small part of her felt that too. What I saw instead was resolve, clear and unshakable, the look of someone who has finally decided exactly what she intends to do with the strength she has built. "It makes me feel," she said slowly, "that it is time I returned home. Not as the frail, discarded daughter my father sent away to disappear quietly, but as something he never once believed I could become." I felt a chill run through me at the certainty in her voice, part apprehension for what such a return might cost her, and part something else entirely, something that felt uncomfortably close to pride. "Are you ready for that?" I asked. She smiled, and for the first time, I saw in that smile the shadow of the queen she might one day become, forged not from the entitlement of birth, but from the hard, unglamorous work of refusing to accept the fate others had chosen for her. "I am not certain anyone is ever fully ready for the moment they must prove themselves," she said. "But I have learned something important these past months, Ronan. Readiness is not a prerequisite for courage. Sometimes you simply have to move forward and discover your readiness in the moving." We began planning her return the very next day. The Dominion capital looked exactly as I remembered it, all glowing blue architecture and cold marble corridors, except this time Alira walked through its gates under her own power, her posture straight, her eyes clear, wearing armor of her own design rather than the delicate ceremonial robes that had once marked her as an ornament rather than a person. News of our return had apparently traveled faster than our transport ship, because a small crowd of courtiers and functionaries had already gathered near the palace steps by the time we arrived, their expressions ranging from open curiosity to poorly concealed shock. I heard murmurs ripple through the assembled crowd as Alira passed, whispers in the low, grinding Dominion tongue that I had learned to understand well enough over the past year to catch fragments of their disbelief. "That cannot be the same girl. She walks like a soldier. The king gave away a dying child. What has he received back?" Alira walked past all of it without acknowledgement, her focus fixed entirely on the palace doors ahead of her, and I fell into step slightly behind her, close enough to offer support if she needed it, though I suspected, watching the confidence in her stride, that she needed nothing of the sort anymore. King Dreven Vantor received us in the same throne room where I had once stood while he calmly discussed the political convenience of his daughter's death. He sat upon his throne with the same cold composure he always carried, but I noticed his hands were gripping the armrests slightly tighter than necessary, a small tell that suggested the reports he had received about his daughter's transformation had unsettled him more than his careful expression let on. "Daughter," he said, his voice carrying the same grinding quality I remembered, though there was something underneath it now that had not been there before. Something almost cautious. "You have returned to us." "I have returned to myself," Illyra said, and her voice carried across the throne room with a clarity and strength that made several courtiers near the walls visibly startle. "Whether I have returned to you is a separate question entirely, one I have not yet decided how to answer." A ripple of shocked murmurs spread through the assembled court. I had spent enough time among Dominion nobility to understand that such open defiance toward the king, especially from his own daughter, was virtually unheard of. Dreven's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, the only sign that her words had struck something beneath his careful composure. "You forget yourself," he said, his tone sharpening. "Whatever transformation your time among the humans has wrought, you remain my daughter, and this remains my court." "I forget nothing," Illyra replied, stepping closer to the throne without any trace of the hesitance that had once defined her every movement in this room. "I remember everything, Father. I remember standing in my chamber while you discussed my death, as though it were a matter of scheduling convenience. I remember being handed to a stranger from another world because disposing of me quietly was more useful to your politics than fighting for my life. I have not forgotten a single moment of it." The throne room had gone entirely silent now, courtiers exchanging glances that ranged from scandalized to something that looked almost like fascination. I stood near the entrance, watching this confrontation unfold, and felt a strange mixture of pride and apprehension twist together in my chest. This was the moment we had prepared for during the long transport back to the capital, but seeing it unfold in person, watching Illyra stand unflinching before the man who had once so casually discarded her, carried a weight that no amount of preparation could have fully readied me for. "I did what was necessary," Dreven said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. "The Dominion cannot afford weakness at its center. You were failing. Every physician confirmed it. I made the decision any responsible ruler would have made in my position." "You made the decision that was easiest for you," Illyra countered, "and dressed it in the language of necessity, because that language absolves you of having to feel anything about the daughter you gave away. But here is what you did not account for, Father. You assumed that sending me away meant sending me toward an ending. You never once considered that you might be sending me toward a beginning instead." She turned then, gesturing toward me with a motion that carried none of the shame she might once have felt at acknowledging a human in this cold, hierarchical court. "This man and his people did not simply heal my body, though they did that as well, more thoroughly than your own physicians ever attempted. They taught me something your entire court has never understood. They taught me that strength is not something you are born possessing or lacking. It is something you build, moment by moment, choice by choice. Through every failure you refuse to let define you." Dreven's expression had shifted from cold composure to something more complicated, an emotion I could not quite name, flickering across features that had spent decades learning to reveal nothing. "And what would you have me do with this information, daughter? Grant you the throne you were never meant to inherit?" "I would have you understand," Illyra said, "that the throne was never yours to withhold from me based on a weakness I did not choose and could not control. But I have not returned today to demand a crown, Father. I have returned to show you, and this entire court, exactly what became of the daughter you believed you were discarding." She turned to face the assembled courtiers, her voice carrying across the vast chamber with an authority that seemed to fill the space entirely. "For those of you whispering in these halls about the frail princess sent away to quietly die among the humans, I would invite any among you to test that assumption personally, should you doubt the truth of what stands before you now." The silence that followed was thick with tension, until a figure stepped forward from among the courtiers, a tall Dominion noble I recognized from Alira's earlier briefings as Lord Kestrel Van, a rival claimant to influence within the court, who had spent years quietly maneuvering against her father's position while publicly maintaining loyal appearances. "A bold claim," Kestrel said, his voice carrying an edge of mockery. "Perhaps we should test whether human training amounts to anything more than theatrical posturing." Alira's expression did not so much as flicker. "As you wish, Lord Kestrel, though I would advise you to reconsider. This is not a demonstration I intend to lose." What followed was not a formal duel, not yet, but a smaller demonstration arranged within the palace training grounds that afternoon, word of the confrontation having spread through the court with astonishing speed. Half the palace seemed to have gathered to watch, courtiers and guards alike, drawn by curiosity and the rare spectacle of open challenge within walls that typically enforced rigid decorum. Kestrel was skilled, I could see that immediately, trained in the traditional Dominion combat forms that emphasized precision and controlled aggression. But Alira moved differently than anything the assembled court had likely ever witnessed, blending the fluid discipline of her homeworld's traditional forms with the adaptive, relentless tenacity of human combat training, a hybrid style that seemed to catch Kestrel off guard within the first several exchanges. I watched her fight with a mixture of pride and quiet astonishment, remembering the trembling girl who could barely stand unassisted little more than a year earlier, now moving with a controlled ferocity that left no doubt in anyone's mind, watching that whatever weakness her father's court had once perceived in her had been utterly and permanently transformed. The match ended with Kestrel disarmed and yielding, breathing hard, staring at Alira with an expression that had shifted entirely from mockery to genuine respect. The assembled crowd remained silent for a long moment before a slow ripple of murmurs began, no longer whispers of disbelief at what had happened to the princess, but something closer to awe at what she had clearly become. King Dreven had watched the entire exchange from a raised platform overlooking the training grounds, his expression unreadable throughout, though I noticed his posture had shifted subtly by the time the match concluded, a stiffness in his shoulders that suggested he was recalculating something fundamental about the daughter he thought he understood. That evening, he summoned Alira to a private audience, one I was permitted to attend only because she insisted on my presence, a small act of defiance against a court that still struggled to accept a human standing within its most private chambers. "You have made yourself a problem," Dreven said, once the doors had closed behind us, his voice quieter now than it had been in the throne room, stripped of its earlier performative authority. "I have made myself exactly what you should have helped me become in the first place," Alira replied, standing before him without any trace of the deference she might once have shown. "The difference is that I did it without you, father. I did it with people who saw value in me when you saw only inconvenience." Dreven was silent for a long moment, studying his daughter with an expression I had never seen him wear before, something that looked almost, impossibly, like uncertainty. "The rival houses will use this," he said finally. "Your return, your demonstrated strength, they will use it to question my judgment, to argue that I failed to recognize potential I should have cultivated myself." "That is not my concern," Alira said. "I did not return to protect your political position, father. I returned because I refused to let the story you wrote about me stand as the final word. You decided I was finished before I ever had a true chance to fight. I have proven that decision wrong, and I intend to keep proving it wrong for as long as I draw breath." "And what do you want?" Dreven asked, and for the first time in the entire encounter, his voice carried something that sounded almost like genuine curiosity rather than calculated authority. "If not the throne, if not my approval, what is it you have returned here seeking?" Alira considered the question for a long moment before answering, and when she spoke, her voice carried a certainty that seemed to settle over the room like a physical weight. "I want this court, and every house within it, to understand that strength is not a birthright reserved for those born whole and perfect," she said. "I want them to understand that the weak and the discarded are not fixed categories, sentences handed down at birth and never revisited. I want to build something new, Father, whether within your dominion or entirely apart from it, founded on the understanding that anyone given a genuine chance to fight for themselves might surprise you with exactly how far they are capable of rising. Dreven was silent for a long time after that, and when he finally spoke, his voice had lost the cold composure that had defined every previous interaction I had witnessed between them. Your mother, he said quietly, believed something similar before she passed. She always said I ruled through fear of weakness rather than confidence in strength. I did not understand what she meant, not truly, until this moment. Illyra's expression softened, just slightly. At the mention of a mother, I knew she had lost too young to remember clearly. Perhaps it is not too late to understand it now, she said. The audience ended without resolution that night. No grand reconciliation, no immediate restoration of a throne. Illyra had made clear she did not simply want handed to her. But something had shifted within that private chamber, a crack in the rigid hierarchy that had once defined everything about how the Dominion understood strength and worth. Whatever came next, I understood that the frail, discarded girl I had carried out of that palace, little more than a year before, no longer existed in any meaningful sense. In her place stood someone entirely new, forged through struggle rather than granted through birth, and the entire Dominion was only beginning to reckon with exactly what that transformation might mean for everyone within its reach. The crisis came 3 weeks later, and it came exactly the way Illyra had quietly predicted it might, though even she seemed surprised by how quickly the rival houses moved once they sensed an opening. I was in the guest quarters we had been assigned within the palace when the alarms sounded, a deep, resonant tone that echoed through the corridors and sent servants scattering in every direction. Illyra burst through my door moments later, already dressed in the combat gear she had taken to wearing beneath her formal robes, a precaution I had thought excessive until that exact moment. Lord Kestrel has made his move, she said, her voice tight with controlled urgency. He has gathered support from 3 other houses. They are claiming my father's judgment has been compromised, that his willingness to entertain my return signals weakness the Dominion cannot afford at its center. What does that mean? I asked, already moving to gather what limited equipment I had brought with us. It means they intend to force a succession crisis, she said. Under Old Dominion law, if enough houses declare a formal challenge to the king's fitness to rule, the matter is settled through combat trial, a fight to determine whose claim to leadership carries true legitimacy. Kestrel intends to challenge my father directly, and if he wins, he will not simply take the throne. He will eliminate every possible rival to his new authority, myself included. We reached the throne room to find it already in chaos, courtiers pressed against the walls, guards standing in tense, uncertain formations, unsure whether their loyalty belonged to a king whose authority was actively being challenged, or to whatever new order might emerge from the confrontation unfolding before them. King Dreven stood before his throne, no longer seated in it, facing Lord Kestrel and 3 other house representatives across the wide chamber floor. "This is madness," Dreven said, his voice carrying clearly, despite the tension thick in the air. "You would tear apart generations of stability over a matter of succession politics. We would prevent further weakness from infecting the throne," Kestrel replied, his voice carrying the confident authority of a man who believed he had already won. "Your daughter's return, and your willingness to entertain her presence at court, proves that your judgment has been compromised by sentiment. The Dominion requires a ruler who understands that strength alone determines legitimacy, not fragile human notions of second chances and redemption." Illyra stepped forward before her father could respond, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Then perhaps it is my legitimacy you should be questioning, Lord Kestrel, rather than my father's. I recall defeating you quite soundly on this very training ground only 3 weeks ago." Kestrel's expression twisted with barely concealed anger at the reminder. A single demonstration proves nothing beyond momentary skill. Formal combat trial follows different rules entirely, Princess. Rules that favor those trained since birth in true Dominion tradition, not whatever undisciplined human techniques you have picked up during your exile. Then let us settle this properly, Illyra said, and I felt my stomach tighten at the certainty in her voice. I formally challenge your claim, Lord Kestrel. Not on my father's behalf, but on behalf of every person within this dominion who has ever been told their worth was fixed at birth, unchangeable, undeserving of a genuine chance to prove otherwise. If you truly believe strength is only legitimate when inherited rather than earned, prove it. Face me in formal combat trial. The chamber erupted into stunned murmurs. I grabbed her arm, pulling her slightly aside from the assembled court, my voice low and urgent. You don't have to do this. There has to be another way to resolve this that doesn't put your life directly on the line. She turned to face me, and in her eyes I saw not fear, but a calm, settled resolve that told me she had already considered every alternative and arrived at this decision with clear eyes. There is no other way, Ronan, not one that changes anything fundamental about how this dominion understands strength and worth. If I do not stand and fight for what I believe now, everything I have built these past months means nothing. I will not simply survive as proof that transformation is possible. I must be willing to fight for it, publicly, undeniably, or the lesson dies the moment I step back from this challenge. I wanted to argue further, every protective instinct in me screaming against the idea of watching her walk into formal combat against a trained Dominion warrior with years more experience than her hybrid training could account for. But I looked at her face, at the steady certainty in her eyes, and understood that this was not a decision made from recklessness or unresolved anger. This was the natural conclusion of everything she had built over the past year, the full expression of a person who had decided, finally and completely, that she would never again allow others to determine the boundaries of her own worth without a fight. Then I'm staying right here until it's finished, I said. Every second of it. She nodded once, a small gesture of gratitude that carried more weight than words could have managed, before turning back to face the assembled court and formally accepting the terms of combat trial that would be conducted the following morning, under the full observation of every house within the Dominion. That night passed slowly, Illyra spending hours in quiet meditation and light training, refusing to overexert herself before the trial, while still working through the forms that had become as natural to her as breathing. I sat with her for much of it, saying little, understanding that words carried less value in these final hours than simple, steady presence. "Are you afraid?" I asked her at one point, as she sat cross-legged on the floor of her chambers, eyes closed, breathing measured and even. "Terrified," she admitted, without opening her eyes. "But fear and paralysis are not the same thing, Ronan. I learned that lesson from your people, watching stories of soldiers who marched into battles they knew might kill them, not because they lacked fear, but because they understood something mattered more than their fear in that particular moment. I am afraid, and I am going to fight regardless, because what I am fighting for matters more to me than my own survival." The formal combat trial took place the following morning, in the same training grounds where she had defeated Kestrel weeks earlier, though this time the entire Dominion court had gathered to witness the confrontation, along with representatives from rival houses eager to see whether the princess's earlier victory had been genuine skill or simple luck. Kestrel entered the arena first, moving with the confident, precise grace of Dominion warrior tradition, his weapon a long, curved blade that caught the morning light with a dangerous gleam. Illyra entered moments later, dressed in the hybrid combat gear she had designed herself, carrying a shorter, more versatile weapon, better suited to the adaptive fighting style she had spent months perfecting. The trial began without ceremony, the two combatants circling each other for several tense moments before Kestrel struck first, a fast, precise attack that Illyra deflected with a fluid economy of motion that drew a sharp intake of breath from the assembled crowd. What followed was unlike anything the Dominion court had likely witnessed before, a fusion of traditional Dominion combat discipline with the relentless, adaptive tenacity of human fighting philosophy. Each exchange building on the lessons of the last, each near miss transformed into an opportunity rather than a setback. Kestrel was skilled, genuinely so, his years of formal training evident in every calculated strike. But Illyra fought with something he could not match, a fluid willingness to absorb failure and adapt immediately, refusing to let any single exchange determine the outcome of the entire contest. I watched her take hits that would have ended the fight against a less determined opponent, watched her stumble and recover with a speed that spoke to months of grueling physical therapy that had taught her body to never simply accept defeat as final. The turning point came nearly 10 minutes into the exchange, when Kestrel, growing frustrated at his inability to land a decisive blow, overextended on a powerful strike meant to end the contest quickly. Illyra saw the opening immediately, ducking beneath his blade and driving her own weapon forward in a controlled, precise motion that disarmed him completely, sending his blade skittering across the training ground floor while she stood over him, weapon raised, breathing hard but utterly in control. The chamber fell silent, every eye fixed on the scene before them, waiting to see whether the princess would deliver a killing blow that Dominion tradition would have fully sanctioned, given the circumstances of formal combat trial. Illyra lowered her weapon instead, stepping back from Kestrel's prone form. "I will not kill you," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent training ground. "Not because Dominion tradition would forbid it, but because I have learned something your entire philosophy of inherited strength has never understood. True strength does not require the destruction of those who oppose it. It only requires proving them wrong." She turned to face the assembled court, her voice rising with an authority that seemed to fill the entire chamber. "Lord Kestrel believed my strength was illegitimate because it was earned rather than inherited. I have proven that assumption false through combat, exactly as tradition demands. But I would ask this court to consider something further. What kind of dominion do we wish to build going forward? One that discards its people the moment they show weakness, only to fear them the moment they demonstrate strength earned through struggle? Or one willing to recognize that anyone, given a genuine chance, might rise to become far more than their circumstances initially suggested?" King Dreven stepped forward then, his expression carrying none of the cold composure I had witnessed during our very first encounter in this palace, replaced instead by something that looked remarkably like genuine pride. "My daughter has answered Lord Kestrel's challenge, according to every tradition this court holds sacred," he announced, his voice carrying across the silent chamber. "Her legitimacy, and by extension my own judgment in permitting her return, stands proven beyond any further dispute." The following weeks brought changes to the Dominion that I could not have imagined when we first departed for Chorus Station over a year earlier. Illyra did not take the throne, not immediately, choosing instead to establish something entirely new within the Dominion's rigid hierarchy, a training program open to any citizen regardless of their birth circumstances, designed to prove that strength could be built rather than simply inherited. King Dreven, humbled by the events of that final confrontation, began quietly implementing reforms to Dominion medical and social policy, ensuring that no future citizen would face the quiet, bureaucratic dismissal his own daughter had once endured. I stood beside Illyra during the formal ceremony marking the opening of her new academy, watching her address a crowd of young Dominion citizens, many of them bearing the same marks of illness or disability that had once marked her for quiet disposal. "I stand before you today," she said, her voice carrying across the assembled crowd with the same clarity and strength I had watched her build over the past year. "Not because I was born strong, but because I was given a genuine chance to become strong by people who refused to accept that my circumstances at birth should determine my worth for the rest of my life. That chance changed everything for me. I intend to ensure that every one of you receives that same chance, regardless of what any court, any tradition, or any king once believed about your limitations." Later that evening, standing together on a balcony overlooking the Dominion capital as its twin moons rose slowly over the horizon. Illyra turned to me with an expression I had come to know well over the past year, equal parts gratitude and fierce, settled determination. "Do you know what I have learned through all of this, Ronan?" she said quietly. "Tell me," I said. "I have learned that transformation is never truly finished," she said. "My father believed strength was a fixed inheritance, granted or denied at birth. I once believed the same, in my own way, believing my illness had permanently defined the boundaries of what I could become. But I understand now that we are never simply finished becoming ourselves. Every day offers a new chance to choose growth over resignation, effort over despair. That lesson did not come from Dominion tradition or from royal birthright. It came from watching your people refuse to give up on a girl everyone else had already decided was not worth saving." I looked out over the glittering capital that had once cast her aside without a second thought, now slowly transforming under the weight of everything she had proven possible. "You did that," I said. "Not me, not my people. You chose to keep fighting, every single day, even when it would have been easier to accept the story others had already written for you." She smiled then, the same fierce, unguarded smile that had first surprised me all those months ago in that quiet courtyard on Chorus Station, watching alien moons rise over a body finally strong enough to stand beneath them without support. "Perhaps we built it together," she said, "a frail princess and a stubborn human who refused to believe her story was already finished. I think that combination may prove far more powerful than either of us could have managed alone." Standing there together, watching the Dominion capital glow beneath its rising moons, I understood that whatever came next for the Dominion, for Illyra, for the fragile alliance between our two peoples, we had already proven something far more valuable than any single political victory. We had proven that no one's story is ever truly finished, so long as someone remains willing to fight for the possibility of what comes next.